being more inclusive it's not only the right thing to do, the good thing to do, but I'll go back to what Kyle Dubas said. Any organization is going to benefit from having different people at the table with different ideas. And no matter what your business, I've said it before, you evolve or you die.
Welcome to the second episode of The Diversity Imperative, a podcast dedicated to unearthing the agriculture sector's potential. We'll talk with diverse voices and industry leaders to motivate listeners to take their organizations, whether it's the family farm or a life science company, to the next level when it comes to stewarding their most important resource, people. My name is Hannah Conchu, and I am a grain farmer from Cluny, Alberta.
And I'm Erin Gowerluck, and I lead a national grower association in the nation's capital. Our goal each episode will be to dig into some great conversations that go beyond 280 characters, and then seek to inspire a broader dialogue engaging all people in our sector, regardless of gender, race, and ethnicity, or sexual orientation. Through rich and candid conversations, which consider a variety of perspectives, we look forward to exploring ways to overcome barriers and make diversity and inclusion a topic that everyone is comfortable talking about. So Hannah, a couple of weeks ago, you and I sat down to record our first episode of the Diversity Imperative, and we talked to our good friend Dan Wright, who is the head of seeds with Syngenta Canada. And towards the end of our conversation, you asked Dan what he hoped we might cover as part of season 1.
I did, and he encouraged us to consider how the world of sport, and in particular how hockey, has initiated a conversation to address racism and to work towards a more diverse and inclusive sport.
That's right. So we reached out to someone who has not only had a rinkside seat to the conversation that Canada's hockey community has been having, but who herself has had to find her own way in a largely male-dominated industry.
That's right. As a reporter for Sportsnet and Hockey Night in Canada, boasting over 20 years of broadcast experience and a lifetime of hockey knowledge, Christine Simpson has witnessed firsthand how Canada's hockey community has grappled with racism and intolerance. She has covered the remarkable stories of personal determination and commitment to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to experience the many benefits that come from sport. That's why we've invited her to join us on today's episode to share what she has learned with Canada's agriculture sector, a sector which has a lot in common with Canada's hockey community. Like agriculture, hockey is an important part of the cultural fabric of Canada. Both agriculture and hockey have deep roots in Canada's rural communities and have yet to fully realize the tremendous potential that can be reached when we embrace inclusion.
Good morning, Christine. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, ladies. It's wonderful to be joining you today. Thanks so much for inviting me.
As Hannah mentioned at the top, our podcast partner, Dan Wright with Syngenta Canada, planted that seed with us that we should, as part of season 1, take a closer look to the NHL and sport to see what we could learn from outside our sector when it comes to initiatives that are related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we thought, who better to speak with than you? So lay this out for us. What are some of the burning issues or conversations that hockey in particular has been grappling with right now when it comes to diversity and inclusion?
Well, I think that hockey is dealing with many of the same issues that our society in general are dealing with right now. All facets of the hockey world, I think, are kind of taking an inward look and saying, how can we be better? What can we be doing differently? So from where I sit, that includes players. And I can give an example of just this week, I did an interview with Wayne Simmons, one of the newest members of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And his story was talking about Willie O'Ree, the first Black man to play in the NHL back in 1958. And as Wayne said, if it weren't for Willie O'Ree, I would not be in the NHL. Jerome McGinley would not be in the NHL. Grant Fuhr would not be in the NHL. I mean, as he put it, we needed to see someone like us doing it to believe that we actually could do it as well. So from a player perspective, there are definitely, and we can get into it more, the different groups that are doing more to open the game up to a whole community that may have felt that they, were excluded in the past. But from where I sit, it also includes broadcasters. When I started in this business in the late 90s, one of the few women covering hockey, I am so excited to see more and more women in my role, and not just my role on camera, but, behind the scenes, producers, directors. My colleague, Harnarayan Singh, who, from Brooks, Alberta, who started doing Hockey Night in Canada Punjabi for that community who, wanted to hear the sport in their language. And now this year is doing English play-by-play. So you have, I actually was on a panel with him a couple of weeks ago, and I'm thinking, here you've got me, a woman, and a guy with a turban talking hockey. Who would have thought this years ago? So there's the broadcast side and the fan base. Hockey is a business like any, and if you are not, doing things to grow your fan base, you're going to find yourself in trouble. And obviously that will include when we can go to arenas and actually be in seats again. But for us as a television network, our viewers, we want to make it as welcoming to as many people as we can. So in the hockey world, I'd say on all of those fronts, people are having these conversations.
It's such an important inward look to do. And when you talk about hockey's fan base, that's the same conversation that the ag sector is having about our customers. We have to think about the people that we're connecting with who are buying our product. I want to ask you a bit more about something that I heard Wayne Simmons mention this week on your show, Christine. So he mentioned the work of the HDA, the Hockey Diversity Alliance. Of course, this organization was founded by Akeem Elou and Evander Kane and a number of other hockey players with the overreaching goal to eradicate racism in the NHL. So this organization has now gone completely independent of the NHL. And they're asking the NHL to work quicker and to really get on board with what they're trying to accomplish. What do you observe about the pace of change and the willingness of the NHL to take action on racism?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've had many of these discussions with various members of the HDA, but I've also had this discussion with people at the National Hockey League. And so I think it's not the worst thing in the world that the HDA is saying, hey, NHL, speed up. You got to do more. You've got to do it quickly, because they're putting the pressure on the NHL. I do know, though, too, that the NHL is doing a lot behind the scenes, but I'm sure as any big corporation knows, things always take longer than you would like them to. But I absolutely believe that the NHL is committed to it, and I'll tell you why. A few years ago, Gary Bettman hired a woman by the name of Kim Davis to be his executive VP of Social Impact and Growth Initiatives. So Kim Davis, she does not come from a hockey world. Like, she was with Morgan Stanley in New York. I mean, she is a businesswoman. And at the time, she and her company were hired to consult to do a project on the NHL. Who, good for them, we're looking at, okay, what could we be doing better in this field? And as Kim tells us, we presented our report to Gary Bettman and the league. And she said, I knew there were a lot of things in our report that they would not like to hear. And to Gary Bettman's credit, he basically said, okay, Kim, yeah, you're right. We see that we're lagging behind in certain areas, and we want you to help us fix it. So all of a sudden, Kim Davis is a senior executive at the NHL. And as I say, I give credit to Gary Bettman because, you could... I think over the years, a lot of people would say, oh, it's an old boys club. It's just sort of, it's men who know what they're doing, and they aren't really looking for other ways of looking at things, or even necessarily admitting that maybe they're lacking in certain ways. So I know that Kim Davis has worked very hard, not only from within the league, working with the teams, setting up committees on diversity, but also committees. I mean, they've got young fans that are part of a committee to help them understand how do we get to young fans in a way that, is different from our older generation. So I still feel that I've seen change, but there is definitely change to come. Is it ever going to be as quick as some people want it? No, but you can see examples at the team level, and I'll take the Toronto Maple Leafs as an example. This past summer, MLSE, Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment, hired their very first VP of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Terry Dennis Davis. And I think, too, even a couple of years ago, when Kyle Dubas, the general manager of the Leafs, hired Haley Wickenheiser, in player development. And he said at the time, which was so true, if you have the same group of people in the room, you're missing out on different ways of looking at things. And I loved his quote. He said, if all you do is hire white males, and he said, and I'm saying this as a white male, you're missing out on other approaches, other ways of looking at things. And, there's been enough studies done to show that diverse companies are more successful companies because they are looking at things from all different ways. I mean, it's so easy to be in an echo chamber and just be saying the things that everyone else at the table, no matter what the group, if they all look like you, you're probably going to think in very similar ways. If they all have the same background as you, you're going to think, okay, this is the best way of doing things. Well, maybe it isn't always. So to have other voices in the room is important. And we are seeing that at the NHL level. And I just feel we'll continue to see more of it.
I want to ask you a bit more about women's hockey. So we've watched the NWHL and the CWHL really struggle over the years to take hold as viable leagues, which is something that I've paid attention to as I watch my friends come up through the women's hockey programs that often end after university, so either in the US or in Canada. And so we've seen recent partnerships announced between the Professional Women's Hockey Players Association, the PWHPA, that's quite the acronym, and the Toronto Maple Leafs, where the Maple Leafs will formally support the PWHPA in sponsorship. And just this week, we heard about another sponsorship, just like that one, between the Blackhawks and the PWHPA. Mm-hmm. So in your mind, what do you think it's going to take for the PWHPA to be a viable women's hockey league that allows female players to make a living wage and be afforded the similar opportunities as their male counterparts?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's one I think that a lot of people are grappling with right now. To your point, it has been wonderful to see NHL teams stepping up, like the Leafs, like the Blackhawks recently. And actually, I think the New York Rangers were the first team to say, yes, we will have PWHPA teams play at Madison Square Garden. We will help support them in marketing. I am not an expert of the women's game just because my focus is with the NHL. But the good news is you can't ignore. I mean, the conversations are out there, and the women who are leading the charge are amazing women, and give them credit. My understanding has always been, as you mentioned, CWHL, which was doing very well. I mean, we showed their games on Sportsnet, and then they went away. The NWHL is still in existence, mainly in the States. I think a lot of people feel that the model that will have the most success will be when and if the NHL creates a WNHL in a similar model to the NBA, what they've done with the WNBA. I think the PWHPA is happening now because of the demise of the CWHL, and still just wanting to have women have a place to play. But I kind of feel like everyone is still waiting for the NHL to kind of take the lead in saying, this is what we need to do to come under, the same umbrella. Now, in the middle of a pandemic, it certainly hasn't helped things, especially when you see the, NWL that we're doing their tournament down in Lake Placid, and COVID became an issue. So I give credit to the women who are still trying to keep the profile of the women's game up, and companies, for instance, like Bauer, who are doing a ton of work in this field as well. I don't have the magical answer, but I do feel that the NHL at some point, hopefully not just the individual teams that we are seeing right now, but at some point will kind of step in and perhaps have a similar model to what we're seeing in the NBA.
Good. It's good to get your perspective on that. And we'll be watching closely, Christine, to see what happens there.
Christine, I'm curious to know, reflecting on how all of this has come to pass, where you saw the real momentum start to build for these important conversations, or this movement, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd say on a couple of fronts, from women in this field, the Me Too movement, of a couple of years ago, to me, that's what started a lot of conversations in my office and amongst friends. And you probably know this as well. When you are often the only woman in the room and working in a very male-dominated industry, you kind of, I mean, I put it this way, I never felt like hard done by, but you kind of put your head down. You ignore a lot of things. You ignore a lot of behavior. You ignore a lot of vocabulary that's used, and you just sort of focus on, okay, you kind of have to be one of the boys if you're going to play in the boys' sandbox. And you don't really think of what that's doing to you. And so Me Too, in my opinion, sort of gave women the permission, if you might say, to sort of step up and say in that boardroom meeting, you know what, that isn't cool, what you just said. Or that isn't cool that you're dismissing the opportunity of having more women. Like, why do I watch every Saturday night and just see men? So that started, I guess, me finding my voice in feeling, and obviously as someone who's been in the industry for long enough, I'm not as concerned as I would have been if I was starting out, where it's like, well, that's wrong, but I can't say anything about it. Well, I can, because I'd like to feel like I'm respected by the men in the room when I am pointing out certain things that just aren't okay. And so I see even the change that happened at our place, even from the standpoint when you look at representation, 2 years ago, having to fight pretty hard to get an all-female panel on Hockey Night in Canada in our pregame show on International Women's Day. Well, a year later, which was last March 8th, we had our first all-female broadcast of an NHL game. March 8th in Calgary, the Flames and the Vegas Golden Knights, and it was myself, Cassie Campbell-Pascal, and Leah Hextall. So not just on, in front of the camera, but behind the camera, female producer, director, the majority of our production staff were women. So that's where I say, we fought for that. And we got it. And we had male allies along the way. And I will mention Ron McLean is one man at our network that always has our back. So give him credit as well. But that sort of started the conversations from, a racial injustice. I think last summer, we all feel last summer was kind of a tipping point from that perspective, and maybe partly because of a pandemic. We're all at home, we're all watching TV, and you see George Floyd. And that obviously led to, as you saw, more of our superstar athletes using their platform and using their voice. Really, in my opinion, the NBA and the WNBA leading the charge on that front. And then eventually, with the hockey players just deciding, no, this is it. You have Matt Dumba giving the speech that he did, taking a knee. You've got Ryan Reeves, out in the Edmonton bubble with all of the players behind him saying, we need to do something about this. So to me, like that, those are the things that I have seen that have sort of almost started the revolution in my world. And I think that's what also helps normalize conversations. Like, we wouldn't be having this conversation a few years ago. The fact that we are means that it is more normal. It is something that we should be more aware of and talking about. So I guess that's, to me, where on both fronts these conversations started, and I'm just glad to see that they continue.
I don't know if you notice Hannah and I nodding along with you when you talk about some of your own personal experiences around the board table, for example, right? And I expect that many women listening to this conversation will also be nodding in agreement. So it turns out that there may be more that the agriculture sector has in common with hockey and with your personal experience, perhaps, than we first thought. I'm also glad that you raised Ron McLean, and we're going to talk a little bit more further in our conversation about what it is to be an ally, because you're right, that's a really important part of this conversation. But before we get there, I want to ask you about something that I know we struggle with in the agriculture sector, and I'd like to know, how did the hockey community engage people that really needed to be a part of this conversation but may have been reluctant to join?
Mm-hmm. Well, I probably go back to a little of what I said in the last answer. It can be a scary thing to sort of be talking about things that people aren't talking about, or, giving your opinion on something that might be a little bit, do I dare? But I do feel like the more people who do it, the more normal it becomes. And, I don't know how else to describe it other than, thinking of things in a different way, and therefore making it more, I go back to normalizing. I think that's it more than anything. It's not weird to have these conversations, or it's not, weird to have some of the stories and features that I do on our network, to have those air, or it's not weird on a Hockey Night in Canada or a Sportsnet Central News show to have highlights of women's hockey shown. Like, it's sometimes those little things, like the women's scores being on the ticker, that really weren't there before. And then you just present them and it's like, oh, it's an awareness that maybe wasn't there before that maybe leads to a conversation, if that makes sense to you.
It does. I think it becomes something that can no longer be ignored.
Right. Yes, that's a good way of putting it.
And you may have already spoken to this, but I want to ask you a bit more in your younger years growing up. You yourself were an athlete, and I expect that a lot of the stories that you cover and that we're discussing here today have to resonate with you in some way. You, as you mentioned, were one of the only women in broadcasting when you first started out. You were, an athlete growing up in London, Ontario, but didn't play hockey, despite the fact that your two brothers did, and you were often in the arena watching their games. Tell us about your own experience in those early years.
Yeah, it's funny because growing up in London, Ontario, as you said, my family were, a real hockey family. And I think too, specifically because I'm the middle sister between two hockey playing brothers, my older brother, Dave, who was drafted by the New York Islanders, my younger brother, Craig, who went on to a 10-year career in the NHL with Edmonton and Pittsburgh. Yet to me, growing up, that's where my love of the game and my knowledge of the game started, was from going to the rinks all the time to watch my brothers. But as much as I was athletic, played, baseball, volleyball, I was on the track team, it never dawned on me to play hockey because, again, this was, in the 70s in London. I didn't see girls playing hockey. So it just never seemed to be something that girls did. So I didn't pursue it. Same thing, when some people say, well, was this your dream job to be a reporter on Hockey Night in Canada? I'm like, no, it never even dawned on me that women could do that. So even though I was sitting with my family every Saturday night watching Hockey Night in Canada and loving every minute of it, it really never did dawn on me that that is something that you could do. So I guess I kind of go back to Wayne Simmons saying, until you see a Willie O'Ree or a Grant Fuhr as a Black kid, you probably don't think that that's something that you could do. For me, as a woman, never dawned on me that hockey broadcasting was something that I could do. And yet I do see the difference now. It's so wonderful when I have young girls reach out to me saying, I want to do what you do because I've grown up watching you do. Like, that is normal. And I give credit to the Maple Leafs each year have had what they call the Next Generation game, where they have young people kind of shadowing every person involved with a broadcast. And so for the last couple of years, we found a wonderful young lady, Abigail Dove from Brooklyn, Ontario. And at 13, I think was her first year. And so she was shadowing me as a rinkside reporter doing the Leaf broadcast. And so, but she's a young girl that has grown up her whole life knowing I can do this. Like, I can do anything that I set my mind to, which wasn't the case when I grew up. And I do feel like I just kind of stumbled into hockey broadcasting from having worked in hockey. I was the marketing manager of the Hockey Hall of Fame for 5 years. I was the Maple Leafs' first in-arena host. But even all of that, I would say, if Sportsnet weren't a brand new network that was starting up in 1998 and looking to give, some new faces a shot at it, I probably still wouldn't be doing this. But I guess it all comes back to, how important representation is. Like, representation does matter, because, I was lucky enough to hear Billie Jean King speak once at an NHL event a couple of years ago. And it's true. Like, if you can see it, you can be it. And if you don't see it, there's probably a huge part of the population that figure, well, I can't do that because women don't do that. And now it's just so wonderful to see, really in every sector, women knowing that they can do whatever they put their minds to.
The conversation around representation and see it to be it, it's coming through in so many areas. And actually, Erin and I this week were having a great conversation about that as well. And for me, growing up, I never considered farming until I was in my 20s. And there were hardly any women around. I think just one neighbor, actually, who was a female farmer that ran her farm. So the idea that you need to see it to be it, it's so important. And like you say, representation is so key. So I want to pick up on what you said about the youth. And so what we're seeing is a real focus of resources and initiatives aimed at ensuring all kids have access to sport and hockey, so that all young athletes, regardless of economic situation, race, and gender inability, they can all play the game they love if they choose. So apart from the obvious benefits that come from giving all kids access to sport, so a sense of community, confidence, connection, scholarships, these are all the great things that sport gave me. Why has it been so important for the hockey community to make such tremendous effort to invest in young athletes in sport?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's, and again, we're talking hockey, but it's the same of any business. If you're not always looking for kind of the next generation to continue to be involved in your sport, it's probably going to go away. So whether that is kids playing, and if they're kids that are playing, then they're probably going to be fans of the sport that, are going to be your fans buying tickets to go to the game. And for us, it's going to be fans that are watching the game. I mean, to me, it's all about evolving as a business, which is always looking to the next generation and young people and making sure that they are interested in your business, or it's going to go away if you're not always thinking to the future and who your next customer is, or who your next fan is, or who your next employee is going to be. To me, that just is common sense in whatever business you happen to be in.
Excellent. I want to go back, Christine, to what you were talking a bit about allies, and you mentioned Ron McLean as one example that all of us have noticed has been a real ally. And I had to laugh when you were talking a bit about the experience of being the only woman at the board table and the important role that allies play. Because I think, Hannah, you and I were having a conversation not that long ago about being in a similar situation as the only woman, and you tend to put your head down and you hope that no one will notice that there's a woman in the room. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I want to ask you about that. And that's going to be this episode's tough question. So every episode we have a tough question, and we ask it of our guest and we ask it of our listeners, and we invite them to weigh in on social media and on our website. So our tough question for you, Christine, is this. Here we are, 3 white women talking about diversity. And while we can, as you have, speak to our own personal experience as women who work in sectors that are largely dominated by men, your role as a journalist covering issues related to diversity and race in particular have positioned you as an ally. Tell us a bit about what it means to be an ally and how we can better understand and support our friends and colleagues whose lived experience is so different from our own.
Mm-hmm. No, it is a great question. To me, being an ally is using my platform to speak not for other people, but on behalf of other people, and to help push agendas that don't necessarily, on the surface look like that you're pushing your own agenda, if that makes sense. So, for instance, for me, I have my platform is millions of people watch what I say every week. I mean, that's a pretty heady thing to know that you have that kind of power. So what I can do is when we are in our story meetings, I can pitch stories that I feel will help our audience understand sort of the bigger world that's out there. And a couple of examples with the Hockey Diversity Alliance. So last summer they formed, and it's just before the return to play. Hockey is coming back up again. And so myself and a few of us pitched, okay, with everything that went on last summer, if we come back on the air, hey guys, hockey's back, everything's great, the world's normal. We just can't. So how do we find a way to put the message out there that, hey, we're thrilled hockey's back. Everyone's thrilled. Like, it's a bit of normalcy in people's lives again. So let's be excited about hockey, but let's not ignore what's going on in our world right now. And as I said, with George Floyd and the movement that we were seeing. And so to me, the Hockey Diversity Alliance, to help profile them, to use their voice to basically open our coverage that night, was like a little gift from heaven, because it's hockey players, but it's them saying, hockey, we need to do better. And so I reached out to Akeem Alou and Evander Kane, and the next thing you know, we're on Zoom meetings with all of the members of the Hockey Diversity Alliance, figuring out how could we do Zoom interviews with each of you to be able to build what we call an opening tease to kick off our hockey coverage at one of the most tumultuous times, in our world. And it ended up being amazing, set to Bob Marley music. The HDA was thrilled that they got that kind of platform, but it's only, you listen to them, you decide, okay, how are we going to help amplify their message? And we did. And then, it's always the way I look at stories. One of the last stories I did before travel kind of shut down was go to Seattle, where the 32nd NHL franchise is going to launch this fall. Well, the Seattle Kraken are looking at things in a completely different way, frankly, than most NHL teams are, as they are building from scratch, their executive team. I interviewed Cami Granato, who they hired as the first full-time female scout for an NHL team. Their analytics, their head of analytics is a woman that came from the Minnesota Wild. I mean, they're looking at things a different way. So I am always looking for stories that help, profile teams and organizations or people that are doing things differently, not only to say, to put them on a platform and say, look at what they're doing, but then also to normalize it. So it's like, oh yeah, that's Cami Granato. She's a scout. She's not a female scout. She's a scout. I'm a female broadcaster for hockey. Well, I'm a broadcaster for hockey, So to me, that's how I can use my platform to be an ally, to be open to people, in the community that I wouldn't necessarily think about, and choose to tell their story. So each of us, I think, have to find what way we can be an ally. And as you mentioned, with Ron McLean, often he'll come to me, hey, I've got a story idea for you. Have you ever heard of this person? Or he can champion a cause that might, that I might be pushing through, that some might wonder, really, is that a story? And those are the ways that you see a different part of, in our case, the hockey world, and you help raise the profile of other people by using your own platform.
I love that. And I love hearing how you use your own position of leadership to elevate other important voices. And I think that's a lot of what we're trying to get at here. One of the main reasons that we really looked forward to having this conversation with you, Chris, is because we see parallels between hockey and agriculture. And we talked about that off the top. One of those parallels is the importance of hockey to rural communities. The hockey rink or the curling rink is usually the heart of every small town. Lack of diversity is something we've also had in common, as well as a culture that has been known to shrug in the face of criticism to say, this is just the way it is. This is just the way it's going to be. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from how hockey has approached this difficult conversation, and you've really nicely laid a lot of that out for us. But in your opinion, what are some of the biggest things that you think agriculture or any other sector that is looking to have these important conversations, what do you think that we can look to learn from hockey?
Well, I would like to think that, being more inclusive it's not only the right thing to do, the good thing to do, but I'll go back to what Kyle Dubas said. Any organization is going to benefit from having different people at the table with different ideas. And no matter what your business, I've said it before, you evolve or you die. And it's true. I mean, that may sound dramatic, but you evolve or you die. Wasn't that long ago that every corner had a Blockbuster Video or a Black's Camera store. These were things that, that's one of the great businesses that are out there. If you're not looking ahead at what, is coming, then it could be a freight train coming your way. And if you haven't planned for the future, if you haven't looked at ways to adjust and to evolve, then to me, you're sunk. And even us, in a television world, my goodness, cable cutters, young kids, we are so aware of how the next generation are watching hockey. So I grew up, as I said, with my family on the couch watching Hockey Night in Canada. So, 3 hours every Saturday night. Kids are not doing that. They're watching it on their phones, or they're watching highlights on YouTube. So our business, our television business, is trying to capture, okay, what do we need to learn from kids? What are they doing? And how can we evolve the way that we present hockey to ensure that we still have, generations of fans to come? And I just think every business, the agricultural business too, needs to look at that. What are the changes that we see coming? What are the things that, down the road could happen? And that's where I say the more people you have in the room to even be making suggestions, the more chance you have at knowing the right way to evolve. Because just to be able to say, this is the way we've always done it for generations and generations, probably is not going to fly with any business.
Thanks, Christine. And maybe just finally, I think you've spoken to this already, but maybe one final opportunity to let us know if you think there may be anything else, when we think about what the future of hockey might look like in, say, 10 or 20 years from now. If these conversations weren't happening in order to make sure that hockey is for everyone, what does that do to the future of the sport?
Yeah. Well, I think even just the fact that you see, new Canadians coming in. So it was easy for what were we all saying? Hey, we grew up as Canadians watching Hockey Night in Canada. So we just sort of by virtue of having a Canadian passport, the vast majority of us were hockey fans. Well, for new Canadians, that's not always the case. They don't grow up watching it. So, it's trying to though tap into that market, tap into those fans, trying to teach them about our sport and why we think it's so wonderful, to make them want to be fans, and women as well. I mean, I do feel like we are going to see female NHL coaches, female NHL GMs. Hey, who knows? There might be women. Hey, Manon Rayon years ago played in an NHL game as a goaltender. I am excited for the future of hockey only because, and really I'd say just in the last few years, we are looking at ourselves and realizing we need to change. And so it excites me to think what could be coming next, instead of scaring me, which maybe a few years ago I would have said, because we're not really listening to what's going on in the world. And, if you do so at your peril.
I love that. Do so at your peril. It's been such a pleasure, Christine, having this conversation with you. Thank you for your time today. If our listeners want to hear more from you, they can find you on your new show. You referenced that. It's The Big Picture, and it airs on Sportsnet on Wednesday evenings. Is that correct?
It does indeed. And it's been fun to, again, profile some great people in the game of hockey. And I look forward to talking to a lot more.
Great. I'm sure many of them will be tuning in as Hannah and I have been. Thank you. And thanks to our listeners for tuning into the second episode of the Diversity and Imperative. Hannah and I look forward to our next conversation in a few weeks' time. Until then, please visit our website, diversityimperative.com, to weigh in on this episode's tough question. And we'd love to hear from you on your social media of choice. You can find Hannah and I at Diversity in Ag on Twitter and Diversity Imperative on Facebook and Instagram. See you next time.